Okay. Welcome, everybody, and Salaam Alaikum. This podcast is organized by Asia West East Centre in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Asia West East is dedicated to improving the relationship between West and East Asia through organizing seminars and conferences and publishing research focused on socio-political developments, economic shifts and diplomacy, cultural flows, and other developments. Today's episode is about decolonizing approaches to mental health, specifically the potential and efficacy of Islamic approaches. It may be a surprise to some of our audience, but over the last 30 years, there have been many developments in the field of Islamic psychology and counselling, and today we will look at some of them and how they relate to the Western tradition of psychotherapy, which has dominated the field up till now. In the podcast are the hosts, Professor Sayed Farid Alatas, Professor of Sociology at the National University of Singapore, and myself, Dr. Munna Bilgrami, Research Associate with the University of Johannesburg, South Africa. Our guests today are Stephen Abdullah Maynard and Sabnum Dharamsi, pioneers of Islamic counselling therapy and training in the United Kingdom. For over 25 years, they have been offering training courses accredited by the CAPCB to prepare counsellors to work a model of the self derived from Islamic sources. Abdullah also founded the Latif Project, a community-based counselling service addressing the mental health needs of the Muslim populations of Birmingham and London. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah and Sabnum, for joining us from the UK. I'd like us to just set the scene, perhaps by inviting us to define what we mean by the key terms here. What do we mean by mental health, Islamic psychology and counselling, and the idea behind decolonizing therapy?
Sabnum, shall I start with mental health?
Yeah, please go ahead.
It's actually a really interesting subject to define within this context, because mental health is always defined within a, let's say, ideological or hegemonic context. So contemporarily, we understand mental health to be that which is a way of being functional, being appropriate, being healthy. But that's a very Western concept, which actually is in a way a bit reductionist. We define mental health, or we define mental ill health, in relation to a wide variety of concerns, such as neuroses and psychoses, including anxiety, depression, and also things like schizophrenia. But the way we frame all of these is in relation to an ability of an individual to function in a family, in a workplace, in a community, in a society. If we take a step out of that Western or Occidental approach to understanding mental health, we can actually think about that from, I would say, a decolonial and a Islamic perspective, which is to think about mental health as including those aspects, but also relating to one's purpose, not in the existential, but one's purpose in terms of one's existence. So mental health then becomes something which relates partly to our relationship with our Creator, as well as our relationship with creation. It's a bigger definition. It's a bigger discussion.
Thank you. Sabnum, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think you kind of covered Islamic psychology and Islamic counselling in that as well, Abdullah. But maybe just to add that in terms of Islamic psychology and Islamic counselling, different perspectives on what well-being is, as Abdullah said, different perspectives on what the self is and the direction of therapy. different perspectives on who the therapist is. And I wanted to point out the difference between, there's a long-standing field within Western psychology or Occidental psychology, Muslim mental health. And we differentiate Islamic psychology and Islamic counselling from Muslim mental health, where Muslim mental health is using mainstream psychological concepts, but in relation to Muslims. And Islamic psychology, which is more about theoretical differences and application. So Islamic counselling, in our perspective, can be applied to Muslims and non-Muslims. And that's really important from a decolonial perspective, because if we're challenging that idea that Western psychology is universal and can just be adapted for specific populations, we're still centering Western psychology. But if we are looking at Islamic psychology and Islamic counselling, we're saying that this is something which is really challenging those concepts, different, coming from a different place, a different understanding, and can potentially work with wider groups of populations.
Well, thank you for clarifying these important distinctions. Perhaps you could, at this point, describe to us the difference, or what is the main difference in approach between the West-centric models and the Islamic ones? I mean, I'm aware that there is not just one Islamic approach, and we'll come to that, I'm sure, in due course. But what are the main differences between the Western models and the general field as it's forming of Islamic approaches?
Shall I, Abdullah? So I think one of the key differences is this, which Abdullah has already referred to, that I think in Western psychology, it's really very much, it's born from it's born in a context which is very much like Freud was, developing his concepts in a colonial context. And so those teachings, those concepts, even though they've been challenged, have the marks of that particular ideology. So they very much work from a perspective of, he was very interested in Darwinism, so they very much come from this idea of an evolutionary perspective, and they cast the other as being lesser and primitive. And I think with Islamic counselling and Islamic psychology, there is such a huge sense of the sacredness of the human being, and the potential of a human being and the vastness of a human being. And that life doesn't only begin with birth, and nor does it end with death. And I think within that, nafsiyat, the science of the self, understanding of the self, is very different in, say, Freudian psychology and client-centered psychology to Islamic psychological understandings. And the idea of human development is also really different. Like, what is our end? What is our end game? What's our purpose? Where are we going to? Where have we come from? What is healing and what's wellness? In modernity, not exclusively, and I don't want to essentialize the whole of Western psychology or Islamic counselling, but in modernity, like if you look at the DSM, which is the sort of Bible for psychological understanding, and they've changed, say, for example, the idea of grief, is sort of pathological when it goes on for longer than 2 weeks. Whereas our understanding, I would say, of suffering, of pain, is part of the human story and essential for our development. I mean, I feel clumsy as I'm saying that because I don't want to be reductive about Western psychology either, but the flavors of them are very different.
Sabnum, I'd like to ask a question that's related to what you just said about the different understandings of grief, and it also relates to what Abdullah was saying when he was defining mental health. So my question is this: is there an aspect of the understanding of mental health, the mainstream understanding, which looks at it as the adjustment of the individual to the outside world? So when the individual fails to adjust, he may have mental health issues. When I'm thinking that we can also can we also say, as a response to that definition, as a critique of that definition, that it may not be the problem of the individual, but it may be the outside world that is unhealthy.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we see this so much, with what's been happening in Gaza and Palestine, that there's now a wider understanding within the mental health field as a whole, I think, of that people and actually as a result of the climate change issue, where it's a political act to say that people are individually sick and depressed and let's heal them. You depoliticize the whole issue. But when you say that actually that depression or that anxiety is a healthy response to an unhealthy situation, you're saying something quite different, and you're working with someone in quite a different way, and you're also placing responsibility in a different way. So there are a lot of people, I think, in modernity, that a lot of individuals who feel that they haven't done enough therapy because they are anxious about things that actually we should be anxious about.
Yeah.
But I think that, I mean, there's another side to this, which of course is that there is a relationship between outer and inner, and the context we're in is the context we're in, and we need to be able to be and exist. So we also do have an individual responsibility and need to be okay, to be okay.
Yeah.
And we can't get away from that, right? It's important.
Yeah.
We can't, it isn't just political or social, nor is it just individual.
Yeah. I was when you mentioned Gaza, I was thinking that there are situations where the world outside of the mind of the individual is clearly unhealthy. When you have war, for example. So I think that's easy for us to understand. That the problem, any mental health issues that an individual may have has to do with the problematic environment. But I was thinking of a situation for many of us where life appears to be normal when it is in fact actually abnormal. I'm reminded of Kafka's story, The Metamorphosis, where Gregor Samsa, the protagonist, decides to opt out of the rat race. He just, he's tired of being on the road, being a salesman, of leading a kind of alienating life, and he decides to stay at home. Well, that idea is sort of symbolized by his turning into an insect. So everyone sees him as an insect. So the way I understand that is that he has actually become human. But when you try to be human in this world, you appear to be strange. You appear to be abnormal, and you are said to have mental health. When actually it's the rat race, the dog eat dog, alienating world of capitalism, which is abnormal and unhealthy. So I'm just wondering whether both of you actually encounter patients who sort of have this experience in life.
I think it's important that we actually start referencing these outer, greater, systemic realities. And part of the reason why I say that is obviously Sabnum and I are working in the United Kingdom. So we're working with a therapeutic model that is universal, but we're working in a country whose ideology believes it's universal. A lot of the things that we've been touching on are very much about the relationship between the political and the psycho-spiritual, or the psycho-political and the psycho-spiritual. And in truth, the individual psyche is malleable, and it is shaped by our relationships, our social relationships, our political relationships, be they immediate or otherwise. And certainly it is shaped by our ability to maintain contact with our spiritual truth. Now, we've just talked a little bit about how Western psychology has a history which is steeped in colonialism, steeped in capitalism, and in a way we're looking at something which is different in an Islamic approach. And as we talk about these realities here in this room, Sabnum and I are also working with individuals in the United Kingdom who are grappling with those realities. Yeah, I mean, we've just talked a little bit about Gaza. So I certainly know that in the United Kingdom, over the last 2 years, the temperature in relation to being Muslim has increased phenomenally, much less the temperature in relation to being an activist in relation to Gaza. And that's just one of the pinch points that are happening within the wider Muslim Ummah at this time. So there is a kind of intersectional stigma that Muslims are carrying when they are trying to live in accordance with their understanding of the deen and trying to live as citizens in a country where they believe that they have a right to profess their political views. So yeah, you're totally correct, Farid. These realities are playing out not just at a theoretical level, but in real time in the way that people are experiencing their well-being.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you sort of say, and in referring to Kafka as well, that sort of alienation of the spirit, and how, there are many clients who will come that are kind of at a point where they are experiencing their own vulnerability through the precariousness of work, the degradation of their spirit through, an employer-employee relationship, or the failure of relationships because of concentrating on that capitalist ideal. And we're not built this way. We're not built to just be tied to that capitalist ideal. And I think I can't remember whether it's Generation Z or Millennials or which one it is. But anyway, the different generations now are kind of thinking, well, like, actually, maybe, is this what I want? How do I want to actually spend my time? What is of value? So there are so many challenges in our current time where people are actually reflecting on this explicitly or implicitly experiencing failures in their lives because it's not working. It's not working. And that's often a point when people seek out therapy. And I think people seek out therapy because now that's, you know, if you can get through the stigma or the fear, you know, now that is the place where you go and you say, I'm precarious, not society's precarious. You say, I'm precarious. I need to get help, and I need to get help for me. And I think that's really significant, because the energy is there in that, on that individual basis, right? That's where things get taken, if that makes sense. Oh, you're on mute, Maynard.
Excuse me. I'd very much like to return to this this idea of admitting your vulnerability and the relationship of that to stigma, because I think Muslims, and particularly in traditional Muslim cultures, there is a taboo and a stigma associated with seeking psychotherapeutic help. But before that, if we could sort of step back a little bit from this sudden deep dive, I wanted to know a little bit more about the field of Islamic counselling as it's been developing in the UK, and how it has evolved since you actually first began, because that's now going back some 25, 30 years ago. Could you speak a little bit to how you developed your area? Because I know that both of you started out as in drugs counselling. So how did this evolve, and what about the field as a whole? What are the general developments?
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. We started out as drugs counselling, and also research in community and for public health and local authorities, and so on, for local government. And so lots of different areas, kind of all around this, I suppose, theme of being well, in as an individual or in society, in community. And then in the drugs field, Abdullah and I were part of a group where we were really interested in looking at the addictions field, and how it was dominated in the UK very much by white male clients that were heroin users. And we felt that there were definitely women clients, there were definitely younger clients, and there were Black and brown people who were experiencing issues with drug use, and we wanted to challenge that. So we started setting up systems and trainings and so on to try and raise awareness, and to try and also see if we could invite clients that were experiencing difficulties with that. So we did that, and it took a long time, but it did have an effect. And then, Abdullah, do you want to continue as well and speak about the HIV in African communities and
Well, this
the
is the
development of
thing.
that?
This is the thing, because then at that point, as time is time, HIV hit. And we can all remember, I'm sure, the politics of HIV. And that meant that there was a certain focus on African communities and HIV. I went into the HIV field from drugs, and one of the things that I set up was a training course in counseling skills, a certificate in counseling in the context of racism. It was aimed specifically at working with our communities in relation to developing counseling skills. I was guided, fortunate, whatever you want to say, to be setting up one of the first transcultural counseling courses at the time. We were supported by the Lincoln Institute of Psychotherapy. So we've gone from drugs, we've gone into transcultural counseling. And of course, we're both working in a way which we're trying to integrate our understanding of reality through our lived relationship with our sheikh as Marines. And we were very, very fortunate in the sheikh that we had, because his understanding of Quran is an incredibly psychological understanding of Quran. And the books that he was writing at the time kind of made it clear that there were therapeutic applications of Islamic knowledge. These were first outlined by his wife, who was also a psychotherapist. We took some training from her, and then we asked if we could take this model forward. And that's how we started the work around Islamic counselling at a time when really in the West there wasn't Islamic counselling, there wasn't Islamic psychotherapy, there wasn't Islamic psychology. Clearly there had been earlier programs within Malaysia because Badri's work precedes ours. One of the ironies was that when we started providing training, we seemed to influence some of the stuff that developed in the US as well. But we developed a program of training, which we then got accredited. And from that, we went on, wrote the Muslim Mental Health Scoping Report, opened the Latif project. And so that's how we've been taking our work forward. Sabnum, do you want to talk about that in a context of the wider developments around Islamic psychology?
Yeah, but also just to go back, when we developed counselling in the context of racism, which, can I just point out the excellence of that title? It was at a time when those challenges to counselling and psychotherapy were very few and far between. It was the first year-long course, which is not long for a professional training, but it was a foundation and it was long. So at that time, and in many ways still, diversity and culture is considered an add-on. So that opportunity for people of color to come to a course where their psyche was not being constantly unraveled and challenged was really significant. And our students were just like, oh, thank God. And we spent the initial part of the training deconstructing and critiquing and being angry and expressing the challenges to being people of color in that course. And then the next part of the course was around looking at indigenous ways of healing. And at that point, I mean, I'd certainly not heard about decoloniality. There was the transcultural psychiatry and transcultural psychology field. But I think that was really significant for the number of people that we encountered. So having done that, and then experiencing the incredible healing potential of Islam through Sheikh Fadl al-Hayri, who's our teacher, we really felt like, oh, actually, if we can translate this into a counselling format, that will be an incredible service and a joy for us to be able to also just share, you know, what we had personally become so transformed by. And I wanted to also say that at that time when we started doing this, it was incredibly challenging because Muslim scholars at that time, or imams, were sort of saying, what are you doing? You know, very clumsily, people should just pray, that will be fine. And a lot of Muslims also experienced, and sometimes still experience, that barrier to coming for therapy because, you know, it's felt that like, you know, you don't need this. This is a Western thing. And we also got challenges from Muslims and non-Muslims within the psychological field, which I'm not going to go into, but there was a lot of barriers. It's so changed now. You know, Islamic psychology and Islamic counselling has been considered to be a movement. People seek it out. People are very interested in nafsiyat, which at that time when we started, wasn't really widely available.
Sorry, do you mind me asking you what to define nafsiyat? What does that mean?
Yes, so nafsiyat is the science of the self from Islamic teachings, based on the Quran and also classical Islamic scholars, and it's from nafsiyat and our lived experience of being with a teacher that our Islamic counselling model has come. So coming back to, the numerous now Islamic psychological models that there are, they all take nafsiyat as their basis. They all have that in common. They're all, I would say, challenging of Western models of psychology. And I guess in some ways we understand ourselves by our difference, although I have kind of issues with that a little bit. But I guess the key model that is out there was one that was developed by Human Keshavazi, Abdullah Rothman, and Rashid Skinner. Are sort of all have collaborated. Rania Awad at Stanford all collaborated in this model, which is called the TIP, traditional Islamic. What are the P's?
No, it's two eyes. Traditional Islamic integrated psychotherapy.
And how do we say, there's sort of the key differences. There are differences in terms of I think in that model there is a lot of attention to it's very much grounded in a traditional Sunni understanding of Islam. It pays a lot of attention to the nuances of Sunni understandings of Islam, and it works I would say, it works on the basis of understanding that there's a balance and a middle path, and around correcting that balance. And it uses, it's very heavily structured in terms of the way it works compared to our model. So I would say that our model is more fluid, more organic, and more focused on simple concepts and the heart of a person, and developing tawakkul and moving towards light. It's very hard to distinguish these different models, aren't there? There's so much overlap.
I think it's also important. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Abdullah, please.
I just wanted to quickly mention that, okay, you've talked, Sabnum, a bit about the TIP model, but it's also important to recognize the work of Rothman in terms of the Shifa method, which was initially taught at Cambridge Muslim College and is now being run by his own service. I think it's also important to note that in relation to these well-renowned models, in the UK, there are also a number of other models, such as the model produced by Sukoon, and also there's that organization in Birmingham. Are they still running a training program? I'm not sure.
Do you mean the TIB-based model?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
That's in Leicester. That's in Leicester, and that's obviously a model which is distinct from the other models that we've just mentioned because of the fact that it is much more biopsychological within an Islamic context, being based on TIB, whereas all of the other models we've been talking about so far have been much more about nafsiyat, as you mentioned.
Yes, so I wanted to go back to the problem of of Western models. You're both talking about Islamic models, and of course there is the view that there is something deficient. There's the issue of deficiency. There's also the issue of irrelevance to some extent of Western models, Western psychological theories and practices. So my question is this: to what extent are these Western models deficient even for non-Muslims, even for Westerners? You know, and sort of related to that is the idea which you had mentioned earlier in the beginning, that your conception of Islamic counseling models is one of universalism. You believe that they are applicable and valid for everyone, not just for Muslims, as I think it should be. Now, how would you argue that if the Islamic counseling model is based on Islamic concepts such as nafsiyah, rooted in the Quran, rooted in the Sufi tradition, and so on and so forth, how would you argue that they, being rooted as such in the Islamic tradition, in Islamic texts and so on, how do they become relevant to, as far as the actual counseling of clients who are not Muslim?
Shall I start on this one, Shabnam? I think at the heart of your question is the question of existential crisis. I think in terms of the everyday, certainly up until the pandemic, people felt that Western therapeutic models were sufficient and effective. Then we had this ridiculous situation where people were dropping down dead for no reason. And we've had crisis after crisis since. And they have been systemic and they have been personal. And what we've seen, certainly in the UK, has been a surge in recorded mental illness, some tapering off, but what's actually quite intriguing about that surge is a significant proportion of it is amongst younger people. Now, I personally interpret that within the conversation that we've been having earlier on about whether or not we're talking about individual well-being or well-being as opposed to societal lack of well-being, to put it as clumsily. Young people are asking big questions about why? What is the purpose of this? Why am I supposed to be living this way? And what we're seeing is increases in people on disability benefits because of mental health and behavioral problems. We're seeing, I think, a breakdown of the relationship between the individual and the society. Now, stepping back historically, as we mentioned earlier on in the conversation, the roots of Occidental, the roots of Western psychology are in the Industrial Revolution, are in material capitalism, are in a colonial context. And if we think about those ideological formats, they do, by their basic nature, reduce the human being to their functionality. So if you've got a psychology which axiomatically sees the human being as functional, and you have a society which has been increasingly dysfunctional over time, but a society that comes to a crisis point where functionality does not make sense, then you get to the place that we appear to be today, wherein, yeah, a lot of people are asking about whether, a lot of people are actually going into therapy because, as Sabnum was saying earlier on, people are carrying the responsibility of, as they have been told, not being well. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who are actually saying, no, no, this isn't me, this is systemic. And in that context, therapeutic models, which are purely related, therapeutic models and psychological understandings that are purely related to functionality are failing. Models and understandings which contextualize the human being in a greater context have much more significance. And that's why I say it comes down to the existential question, because actually, every single one of us lives and every single one of us will die. And every single one of us at some point has to make sense or come to peace with that reality. Now, a therapeutic model that is based on spirituality, an Islamic therapeutic model, has the ability to address that.
So I assume that in other religious traditions, among the Jews, the Christians, the Hindus, they have also thought about these issues, and they also have developed therapeutic models based on spirituality. Do we then say that therapeutic models based on spirituality, based on the Hindu tradition, is for the Hindu, are for the Hindus. Those based on Christian tradition are for Christians, and so on and so forth. Do we compartmentalize therapeutic models based on spirituality in that way? Or would we say that, for example, a therapeutic model based on Islamic tradition is as efficacious for dealing with the mental health of a non-Muslim? So how do we, how do we avoid this problem of fragmentation of models?
Mhm.
Oh,
Go on, Abdullah. Go.
there is that potential problem. There is that potential roadblock. I would suggest to you that certainly within the United Kingdom, there is quite an organized institution of Christian-based therapy, quite an organized one. But at the same time, there are the complexities that go within Christianity, just as there are the complexities that go within Islam. In the time that I've been looking at these wider discussions, I have noted some work being done within the Jewish community. In the UK, I haven't come across anything within the Hindu community. Now, I would suggest to you that part of the reason why I will argue that Islamic psychology is more universal than a Western therapeutic model is simply because of the fact that it is not just a biopsychosocial model, it is a biopsychosocial spiritual model. Now, that does not necessarily mean that it is limited to working with people of Islamic faith. I'd love to take the time to tell you about some work that I did once with a Christian woman around the loss of her child, and working through that therapeutically and psychospiritually. Islamic counseling allows the space for people to be in their reality, not just at a psycho-emotional level, but at a psycho-spiritual level. I would love to believe that other faith-based therapeutic approaches are also that universal in their approach. I don't know. Maybe I need to sit down with, I don't know, maybe I need to sit down with a Jewish therapist and experience that process. But this is how I think we get past this roadblock.
Mm, mm. Yeah, thank you, Abdullah. What I was going to say is that I think that those existential questions that you're referring to, Abdullah, you know, the questions that we have about living and who we are, come to us all in different ways. And so the question of being alive and the question of being human and the question of purpose, and the disturbances to them and how you explain those can be found in spiritual paths, but also in spiritual paths you can find religiosity, and you can find people trying to sell you something, right? You can find belonging, and you can also find tribalism, or I don't know what the word is, tribalism. You can find that idea of, you know, I belong here, and this is where everyone should belong, and we should all do this way. So I think when we say universal, we're saying that, you know, we've been created with light and with love and with hope, that these religious teachings were born from a spirit of resistance against the prevailing sort of direction of society in all ages, not just in modernity. The pharaonic energy, in our teachings, we would describe it as pharaonic energy that would seek to degrade the human spirit. And so when we work, it's about a challenge to that. And and I think in the way that we work, it's kind of not irrelevant. Your biography and your background, and you know, the different things that we belong to and the different names that we give to things is relevant, and it's part of the interaction. But underlying it is this question of, you know, what in Sufi teachings is called the real with a capital letter, the question of what is the real and what is haq and what is truth, what is important, what are we looking for, and this therapy, and I have seen this in Buddhist therapists and Christian therapists and Jewish therapists and Hindu therapists. This therapy is about that light and searching for that light and moving from that darkness, you know, which we see so clearly in modernity and the sickness of society and in our own selves. And it's about that movement, which is we would describe as health and well-being, right? The movement and the process. And even the question I think that you're asking is part of that. Like, is this about being in a club and selling one form of counseling over another? No, it's about humanity and being human and using a map which comes from another source, and not psychologizing it, which is the way of modernity, and not compartmentalizing it, which is why I think also the mental health field is in a mess. You know, because we start getting into places of relativism and, you know, like what is what and all of this. And what we're interested in and what we really love to see in our students and in our clients and in ourselves is really the opening out of that light from a place of difficulty or of darkness. And you know, what might be described in modernity as pathology of you know, being on a self-destructive road, of turning into that spider that you said, you know, like in Kafka, would actually be considered as maybe a healthy response in Islamic psychology and maybe in other psychologies. So we're also fighting in some ways, you know, that sort of way in which, you know, I would say the colonial project of domination and subjugation, we're also fighting that in ourselves, right? And in our model, to not be sort of saying, you know, this is better than all other models. we're actually interested in what this process is saying about our humanity and the way that we live. And that's really what we want to share. And we do it through these teachings because they're beautiful and they're whole and they're helpful. And I always remember what one of my teachers, Alia Hari, actually said to me. She said, "Well, if I found a better method, I would be on my knees and crawling towards that." And I always hold that in relation to our method. If we find something better, let's do that. Yeah.
Could I though pose a question at this point? If we can equate nafsiyat or the ulum al-nafs, the traditional sciences of the self, if they're equatable to an Islamic psychology, and it does answer the questions of who am I, as well as how can you address the needs of mental health, is there a defining line? Where does it stop? I mean, beyond treating pathologies, does Islamic psychology as a whole actually show us how to be better humans, to be more fulfilled? I mean, does Islamic counseling teach eudaimonia? I mean, well-beingness? I'm, the lines seem that, do they blur here somewhere? Because you're talking about something very comprehensive.
I think they do blur, and in my experience, there are, like, many people come to therapy because they're in places of vulnerability, and we all experience that. And those vulnerabilities can, be perceived as huge. For example, incest, or suicidal ideations, or they can be perceived as externally small but internally huge. So people often come because they're in trouble, in other words, in distress. But people also come because they want to be better, because they recognize there are patterns of stuckness. They come because they're experiencing a spiritual transition, because they want to, like, also even in a material sense, they want to get ahead in their careers or their work, or so I think there is a blurring, and I think there should be, probably, that it's helpful, and it's an opportunity to also reflect in a way, in a place which doesn't have an agenda aside from wanting the best for that person. So I advocate it because I think it's helpful. We often don't give ourselves that space to really reflect and see the patterns in our own selves and in our lives. And I think that's also one of the benefits of Islamic counselling training, where people come and they actually get to experience that combination of love and discipline and service, and flourish themselves.
I'd like to add to this by just initially coming back to your question, because I think one of the I experience a problem in the question, and it's a problem that I experience in my own thinking quite often. Living within a neo-colonial, neo-capitalist context, it's very, very easy to frame questions in this way. It's very, very easy to think in this way. I'll give you a joke. Sabnum and I were watching Netflix. Yes, we watch telly. And we were watching a Latin American comedian, Christelle. And I can't remember which of her sets it was, but her sets are called, each program she's done was either lower classy, middle classy, or upper classy, because she's earning money now. And she's come from that Latin American migrant, marginalized context. And
Poverty.
one of the jokes, yeah. And one of the jokes she raised was, I have therapy money. Because she's moved into something where she is now able to do something. Now, if we think of therapy and counseling as, say, people in America think about therapy and counseling, then to say, oh my gosh, I want to go to counseling for development and growth is quite normal, totally normal. But as people who are outside of that, we often think, if we are progressive enough, that therapy is about healing. Okay, fine. So within the West, for some people, it's about healing, but for some people, it's also about growth. So now let's actually think about this from the context of our own reality, our own Islamic reality. We've talked earlier on this subject of functionality, and that's very on-off. And we've also talked about this idea of purpose and relationship with the divine. So if we're talking about a relationship with the divine, that relationship is ongoing through life. That relationship is about a process of learning, a process of growth, a process of transformation. And in that process, Islamic counseling and Islamic psychotherapy, psychology fit. They are not the process, but they enable some of us to address part of it.
Mhm.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you so much. Whew. There's quite a lot to be thinking about here and wrapping your mind around. Can I dial it down a little bit and take us back to what are the recurring needs and struggles that you have noticed in your work that you feel that the counselling uniquely addresses? I mean, you've touched on some of them, but and you've made a reference to, you know, this huge shift that's happened around the time of COVID and post-COVID. I mean, it really has been a time of significant change since then. But are there sort of recurring needs and struggles? Because I'm speaking to you from Malaysia, and I'd like to take us also to discuss, you know, why you're looking forward to coming to Malaysia and sharing more of your work here. So what has happened in the UK that has stood out for you in your work?
Mhm.
I'll start, Sabnum.
Sure.
Rather than recurring, I'd like to talk about an ongoing process.
Okay.
The very first professional qualification in Islamic counseling that Sabnum and I taught was the 2-year program, the professional diploma. The first year was in One World, and the second year it started in September of 2021 or 20, no, what am I saying?
2012.
But no, I'm going mad. Basically, I'll take that back and I'll say it properly. Effectively, during the first term of the second year, we had 9/11.
Oh.
So from there on, there has been a progressive change in the relationship between the state and Muslims, society and Muslims. It's an ongoing, growing, problematic relationship. And that ongoing, growing, problematic relationship has increased the stressors, the existential, the environmental stressors on psychological well-being. It's also made it more and more difficult for us to argue our corner in relation to why this stuff is important. Because, to use the words of Baroness Vasi's book title, Muslims don't matter. So, yeah, we are in an ongoing process of climbing uphill, and the hill is getting steeper.
Mhm.
And that is in itself proof of the fact that there needs to be someone climbing it, if that makes sense.
Mm. And I think I would add, in terms of client work, that those questions are internalized by us. So the insecurity around identity, which I think is there, but it's now really amped up. And also where that means that people are looking for security, and people often look for security in structure and belonging, which then means that there is more polarization in our communities. So you get polarization in Muslim communities, people who are practicing in a certain way, people who aren't practicing, people who are activists, people who are not, but also questions around solidarity and what that means, about community, around generational difficulties, like what my parents want for me. And I think how things often come up as well is, I find that I have a lot of clients who are experiencing relationship difficulties, but also issues around, not being parented or not being loved, around abandonment, around rejection, that maps onto their own selves. And I think, where you were sort of saying about you're coming from Malaysia and, we're working in the UK, one of the things that, was so beautiful when we came to Malaysia previously, and in the event that we did, was to see, a different kind of Muslim community, and to experience sort of, a community that feels in some ways very confident in its Islam, that has a different historical context. And I think it's really exciting for us to see nafsiyat and to see Islamic counselling and psychology and its potential, and to also ask questions about that in a very different Muslim context. I mean, it's really helpful, I think, always to experience different, as the Quran says, different nations and tribes, so that you might know one another and also know yourself. It awakens the mind and the heart to experience that, and I hope vice versa too, right? Because I think one of the things that happens, or there's a potential to happen in Malaysia, is that that there is such a kind of almost perhaps taking for granted that Muslimness, where we're having to fight for it, and also, where you've got, I'm saying this in all humility because I'm really wanting to learn as well, but where you've got a country that is really a kind of has now this very strong sort of sense of growth and development in all areas, which is so tied in with modernity. And one doesn't want to be, you don't want to be a refusenik about it. It's lovely to see that growth and development and so on. But also, what are the challenges of that? And I think we often see in, countries where there is that growth and development, actually big questions around who am I, what's important, what am I prioritizing, what's happening in my family relationships, can I rely on those cultural, markers of the past, like what is happening personally, like there tends to be often more addiction, more issues in families that are kind of kept still held but also not held. So I don't know, I'm very interested to find out, what is going on in Malaysia, and if this can be of use.
Fantastic. In my cursory research about the development of Islamic psychology in Malaysia, there are some resonances with what you have been describing about the UK, even though it's primarily a Muslim majority context. Islamophobia does not really apply consciously. It might be internalized, who knows? It was a former colony, obviously, from the past, so these things still perpetuate. But there is a lot of confusion about different approaches that are Islamic, because, as you said earlier on, Sabnum, the idea perhaps coming from the mosque is that, oh, just do your prayers and, be a good Muslim, be a good, faithful, loyal, a servant of God, and you shouldn't have any problems. Well, we know that anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, bullying, divorce, there's a huge increase in divorce in this country. They're not necessarily directly at all related to how pious you are. And so I think there is a need for us to become clearer about these offerings. And also I've noticed there is a bit of a divide between therapists in Malaysia who are looking to approach things from an Islamic wellspring, and those who are just approaching it from perhaps, well, client-centric, from Jungian or Freudian traditions. And that's reflected in some of the international conferences that they've had here, where you see no representation, for example, of Muslim scholars or therapists, but all the other ethnicities and religions or backgrounds are represented. And I mean, so there's clearly a need for greater clarity here as well. And Malaysia's not immune from all of from a lot of these negative social indicators.
Yeah.
We have, because they're all part of modernity, and
Yeah,
Malaysia
absolutely.
is fully embedded in its own modernity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that, it's been very important for us, that Islamic counselling, Islamic psychology in some ways are saying we want to engage with these current questions so that we're not locked into a very static idea of what Islam is. Allow that really vibrant, dynamic aspect of these teachings to infuse these questions of modernity, and so that we can find the answers in our own hearts, and respond to them in a way where, where we are maybe in a state, inshallah, of worship, whether we're standing, sitting, or in the marketplace being modernity, right? So yeah.
Shabnam and Abdullah, as we come to the end of this very interesting conversation, I'd like to ask about the trainers. We've spoken mostly about Islamic counseling in the context of the clients. But when it comes to the trainers, when it comes to psychologists, counselors, as well as the people that you have experienced training, and you have of course experience in the UK, and you have some familiarity with Malaysia. What do you feel is the what is the extent to which psychologists, counselors are attuned to this problem, critical of the mainstream models, and are aware about the need for alternative models?
I think, sorry, Fareed, I got slightly distracted by the chat. Could you repeat the end part of that question?
Oh, well, just, asking about to what extent do psychologists and counselors, especially those in the Muslim community, but also in general, to what extent are they aware of the need for alternative models?
This is part of the work that we are doing to really raise awareness in the mainstream and in community around what this model is, what alternative models are, and also within the training itself. We try to engage with the professional issues as well, not just professional issues in terms of, like how you work with a client and all of that, but also the debates within the field, because that is part of the politic. Modernity, I think one of the aspects of modernity as a whole is the way that religion, religious, is psychologized. And within that, we also have our own issues around religiosity and our own questions. So part of the training, we begin by like, well, who are we? And, how can we fall in love with this? And we avoid terminology. And then we develop into marrying the terminology of nafsiyat so that we're engaging from that level. And then with the diploma level, it's really trying to look at all of these things, the modern context, the psychological field, what's happening out there, what's happening in here, as well as working with clients. So we're really trying to pack in a huge amount, because these are the questions that are on the table. So we have to respond. And we really try to do our best with that. But also, Farid, I would say that, there is a lot in the training that is also about developing a sense of resistance through a sense of like pride. Actually, we have got things to say and we have got things to believe in that are beautiful. And there is no compulsion here, but we are actually inviting you to be a person who can transmit something of beauty and internalize something of beauty and feel proud of it, right? And feel proud of it. And we're also inviting people to have courage in professional context, to be able to sort of say, yes, I'm an Islamic counselor, and yes, this could be useful for you, and yes, I will speak about it. And often students are very scared to do this. They're scared to present this as something that is whole and good and true, because we're in an environment where we're being continually challenged. And I think the other thing that's really important in student groups is what we also invite people to do, which is really interesting, I think, is as a counter to the individualism of modernity, is we sort of say, like, let's be an ummah with each other. Let's care and share for each other. Let's all help each other to win. Let's all help each other to succeed. Everybody wants to get their qualification and, but also let's share and care for each other. And people, I feel they do that. And I love it when I'm not looking and I turn around and I just see this sort of like real camaraderie that extends beyond the training. And I think, yeah, that's actually so good. That's so good to witness. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sabnum. Thank you, Abdullah, for a deep dive, a deep taste, which has left certainly myself wanting to know more. It's raised as many questions as you've answered, actually. And thank you very much for sharing your insights and your time. And we hope in the future that you will come to Malaysia and we will be able to offer some seminars and workshops in which people can maybe go deeper into this with both of you. It would be an extreme pleasure. And I know that the visit that you made here last year indicated so, and this is why we are going to follow up with a workshop early next year. So watch this space. Thank you, Sabnum. Thank you, Abdullah. And thank you, Farid, for taking us through this.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Maynard. Thank you, Farid, and thank you to Asia for inviting us, and we look forward to being in Malaysia, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a very nice conversation, and we look forward to seeing you here physically and to further conversations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.